The title of my talk today is A Brief History of Greenland and its Significance During World War II and the Cold War Era. Let's examine a very brief history of Greenland prior to World War II, and then delve into its history during the war, followed by events during the Cold War in the 1950s to 1960s time period. Prior to the European interest in Greenland and the Arctic area, the first people traveled from Asia across the Bering Strait to this area. Over the last 5,000 years, three cultural groups migrated to Canada and Greenland from the Asian continent. First came the Sakak, followed by the Dorset. Finally, the Thule or Inuit arrived. Denmark-Norway continued to claim sovereignty over Greenland despite the lack of contact between the Norse Greenlanders and their Scandinavian brethren. Denmark and Norway established the Royal Greenlandic Trading Company and began colonizing Greenland in 1721. At that time, Denmark and Norway sent a missionary expedition to Greenland with the aim of reinstating Christianity among descendants of the Norse Greenlanders, who may have reverted to paganism. This expedition was led by Hans Edge, who has been honored with a statue in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. Denmark governed Greenland as a colony until 1953, when the Danish constitution was amended, changing Greenland's status from a colony to a country. During World War II, in 1940, when Germany invaded Denmark, Greenlanders became socially and economically less connected to Denmark and more connected to the United States and Canada. After the Nazi occupation of Denmark, the Germans allowed the Danish government to remain in power, albeit under heavy supervision. The governors of South and North Greenland, Eske Brun and Axel Svanø, declared Greenland a self-ruling territory. Given that Denmark itself was under German occupation, the Greenland governors considered the Monroe Doctrine, under which the United States would not interfere in the affairs of European colonies. They therefore proclaimed that Greenland was to be considered a self-governing colony. They coordinated with the Danish ambassador to the United States, Henrik Kaufmann, and the U.S. State Department to maintain this status territory. Here is a picture of Henrik Kaufmann. This photo is taken from the film The Good Traitor, which is a docudrama about Kaufmann during his time as ambassador to the US during World War II. Greenland during World War II was considered very important for several reasons. Greenland's position is an ideal location to position airfields for both the transfer of aircraft across the Atlantic and for patrolling the ocean. As the midpoint between North America and Europe, Greenland is situated roughly halfway between North America and Europe, making it a convenient refueling and transfer point for aircraft crossing the Atlantic. Its proximity to the Arctic provided a critical position for patrolling and monitoring the North Atlantic Ocean, which was essential for anti-submarine warfare and protecting convoys from German U-boats. Add to this, Greenland's remote and isolated location made it less vulnerable to enemy attacks, providing a secure base for military operations. Despite the harsh weather conditions, the island's vast flat areas were suitable for constructing airfields and supporting infrastructure. Secondarily, Greenland is the origin point for much of the weather that affects Europe, as a major source of cold air masses that move across the North Atlantic, thus influencing the climate and weather patterns in Europe. The presence of Greenland affects the path of the jet stream, a fast-flowing air current in the upper atmosphere that significantly impacts European weather. The jet stream's position and strength can be altered by Greenland's topography and the cold air masses originating from it. We'll take a look in more detail at the weather patterns in a few minutes' time. The third important reason is that Greenland is also the source of cryolite, a key mineral in the production of aluminum. So, why was cryolite so important? As aluminum was used in warplane production and cryolite was an important ingredient in its production. Molten cryolite is used as a solvent for aluminum oxide. Cryolite has a distinctive history. It played a crucial role in the Hall-Héroult process, an industrial method used to produce aluminum. Before synthetic alternatives were developed, cryolite was essential in reducing the melting point of aluminum oxide, and making the extraction of aluminum metal much more efficient. Cryolite, namely sodium hexafluoroaluminate, is extremely rare. If immersed in water, cryolite becomes essentially invisible. Cryolite was only found in Iqaluit, Greenland, in commercial quantities. Let's look in more detail at the cryolite mine at Iqaluit. The cryolite mine in the summer of 1940 was the major contribution to the economy of Greenland. In 1942, the U.S. Army took over protection of the mine, and as previously mentioned, the mine was a major factor in the U.S. occupation of Greenland during World War II due to cryolite's rarity, and this was the most important of locations where cryolite was found on Earth. It is possibly the only mineral on Earth ever to be mined to commercial extinction. Cryolite was eventually synthesized, reducing the importance of the mine, and production was finally found uneconomical and discontinued in 1987. This photo shows the cryolite mine at Iqaluit during the summer of 1940. Cryolite production at Iqaluit was the major contribution to the economy in Greenland. The manufacture of aluminum was greatly increased during World War II. Export of cryolite shifted from previous European destinations to the US and Canada. Here is a photo of the cryolite mine as it looked in 1987. Greenland's weather reporting location was very important. When the war began in 1939, the Germans found themselves at a disadvantage when it came to gathering and interpreting weather data. Greenland, Jan Mayen Island, and the Svalbard archipelago were examples of prime weather reporting locations, but they were owned by then neutral Denmark and Norway. Why were they so important? Well, European weather forms in the Arctic regions of the Northern Hemisphere, finally drifting west to east. Germany had no colonies in the region that it could use as reporting stations. When Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway during April 1940, these locations were no longer neutral. The Gulf Stream, which flows through the North Atlantic Ocean and around Greenland, plays a significant role in shaping European weather. This powerful ocean current carries warm water from the Gulf of Mexico across the Atlantic, moderating the climate of Western Europe. This diagram shows the positive and negative Arctic oscillation weather patterns critical for the war effort. As an example, the greatest negative value for the Arctic oscillation since 1950 in January was negative 3.767 in 1977, which coincided with the coldest mean January temperature in New York City, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and many other mid-Atlantic locations in that span of time. Although the January Arctic oscillation has been negative only 60.6% of the time, between 1950 and 2010, 9 of the 10 coldest Januaries in New York City since 1950 have coincided with negative Arctic oscillations. In the summer of 1940, Germany established several expeditions to Greenland in the vicinity of Scoresby Sound. While these stations were operated by Scandinavians, they were controlled by the German military with the purpose of feeding meteorological information back to Germany. In the fall of 1940, the British countered the Germans by sending raiding parties to dismantle the radio stations. United States now became interested in Greenland. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, concerned with German activity in the region, discussed solutions with the US military and Henrik Kaufmann, the representative of the Danish government in exile. On February 6, 1941, President Roosevelt gave his approval to a plan to construct several new bases on Greenland. On April 9, 1941, the Hull-Kaufmann Agreement was formally signed. Cordell Hull is known as the longest-serving Secretary of State, holding the position for 11 years in the administration of President Franklin Roosevelt during most of World War II. Kaufmann's agreement was approved by the local officials on Greenland but declared void by the Danish government in Copenhagen. Kaufmann ignored this protest, citing that Denmark was occupied by a hostile power. Consequently, he considered the government to be unable to protect Danish interests. The government responded by charging Kaufmann with high treason and stripping him of his rank. The Hull-Kaufmann Agreement gave the United States the right in Greenland to construct, maintain, and operate airfields, seaplane facilities, any and all other defense facilities as are deemed necessary to protect the sovereignty of Denmark and the territorial integrity of Greenland. Here is a photo of Cordell Hull on the right talking to President Franklin Roosevelt. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Duane conducted a survey of Greenland's west coast in August 1940. Also in August 1940, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Northland cruised along Greenland's east coast, searching for evidence of German military activity. The cutter Northland discovered 3 weather reporting stations being operated by Norwegian collaborators, reporting conditions to Germany. The U.S. State Department reported the situation to British authorities, who dispatched a gunboat to arrest the Norwegians and close the weather stations. The Sirius Dog Sled Patrol is an elite Danish naval unit responsible for patrolling the remote and harsh regions of northern and eastern Greenland. Established in 1941 to combat the Germans' continuing efforts to establish weather stations during World War II, the patrol's primary mission is to conduct long-range reconnaissance and enforce Danish sovereignty in the Arctic wilderness. The patrol operates in pairs using dog sleds, often covering distances of 9,000 to 13,000 miles annually. The unit is now headquartered at Daneborg within the Northeast Greenland National Park, the world's largest national park. The Sirius Dog Sled Patrol during the war was headquartered at Eskimoneis, which until 1941 had been a scientific station. The Germans continued to establish secret weather stations on the eastern coast of Greenland. As one was discovered, another would be established. These stations were to provide them with invaluable meteorological information, both to assist their U-boat campaign and to predict the weather in the European theater. This chart shows the location and names of all the U.S. bases in Greenland during World War II. The name WWII was the United States military code name for Greenland during the war. It is remembered by the numbered sequence of base locations identified by the 1941 United States Coast Guard's South Greenland Survey Expedition, subsequently used in radio communications by airmen unfamiliar with pronunciation of the Inuit and Old Norse names of those locations. WWII West 1 Airfield, later known as Narsarsuaq Air Base, was built on a glacial moraine near the southern tip of Greenland. Construction by the U.S. Army began in June 1941 with the Army's Greenland force consisting of a battalion of the 21st Engineers. So, what is a glacial moraine? It is a landform created by the accumulation of debris, such as rocks and soil, that a glacier has transported. As a glacier moves, it picks up material from the ground and carries it along. When the glacier melts or retreats, it deposits this material, forming various types of moraines. The first aircraft landed at WWII in January 1942 as a link in the North Atlantic air ferry route. The base had a peak population of about 4,000 American servicemen, and it is estimated that some 10,000 aircraft landed there en route to the war in Europe and North Africa. This is an aerial photo of WWII taken after the war in 1950. The urgent need for establishing airfields in Greenland caused the Army to launch several survey expeditions. Dog teams were used to reconnoiter the area around Angmagssalik, which was to become WWII East 2 Air Base. During November 1941, an alluvial shelf at the base of high mountains, which faced a narrow strait, was identified. An alluvial shelf is a geological feature typically found along riverbanks or at the mouths of rivers. It's created by the deposition of sediments like silt, sand, clay, and gravel that have been transported by the river. Over time, these sediments accumulate and form a shelf-like structure. WWII East 2 never attained the prominence in transatlantic air traffic originally intended, but it served very well in the alternate airfield, meteorology and navigation, and search and rescue support capacities. The base was abandoned in 1947. Let's look at some recent photos of what's left of the WWII East 2 Air Base. Today, remnants of WWII East 2 include thousands of rusted fuel drums, twisted metal, and abandoned buildings. The site is a mix of historical intrigue and natural beauty, with the stunning backdrop of mountains and glaciers. While there have been discussions about cleaning up the site due to toxic waste concerns, many locals prefer to keep it as is, as it has become a bit of a tourist attraction. Abandoned in 1947, and everything was left behind, including over 10,000 fuel barrels. If the sun is hitting these barrels, it looks like flowers from a distance. That's why the Inuit people who live in the area call the rusted remains American flowers. Following reports of toxic waste, Denmark agreed to clean up this deserted site. The locals, however, prefer it to remain, as it is a bit of a tourist draw. They say that any fuel contamination has long disappeared, and all that remains are the rusted metal heaps and drums left behind some 70+ years ago. Should you want to visit this site, you land in Kulusuk, and from there take a 40-minute boat ride to Tasiilaq on the island of Angmagssalik. Here, boat rides can be taken to WWII East 2. The 1942 Lost Squadron in Greenland and the story of Glacier Girl. On 15th July 1942, due to poor weather and limited visibility, 6 P-38 fighters of 94th Fighter Squadron and 2 B-17 bombers of a bombardment squadron were forced to return to Greenland en route to the British Isles during Operation Bolero. The aircraft were forced to make emergency landings on the ice field. All the crew members were subsequently rescued. Glacier Girl, along with the unit's 5 other P-38s and the 2 B-17s, were eventually buried under 268 feet of snow and ice and 2 miles from their original location. They started looking for the planes in 1988. The planes were eventually found in 1992. 2 components, ice accumulation and simultaneous ice flow, account for the 2-mile motion. Here is a short video of anecdotal and historical interest regarding Glacier Girl. The graphics are interesting, but the science has since been updated.
1942, 2 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 6 P-38 Lightnings flying from the United States to England were forced to make an emergency landing on Greenland's southern ice cap. The crew was rescued, but the planes were left on the ice. In 1988, Pat Epps and Richard Taylor led a team to find these missing planes. They expected to find them within 40 feet of the surface. They did not. After several years of failure, the planes were finally found in 1992, 1 mile from the landing site and 268 feet below the ice surface. The team used hot water to dig a tunnel down to one of the planes to extract it. Dubbed the Glacier Girl, the plane was restored and is now flying again. The planes did not sink to a depth of 268 feet, nor did the glacier push them down to that depth. If that were the case, the planes would have been ripped apart. Rather, 268 feet of ice accumulated on them from 1941 to 1992.
Here is a photo of Glacier Girl as they found her. The recovered aircraft was transported to the United States, where it was painstakingly restored to flying condition. Glacier Girl made its first post-recovery flight in October 2002 and has since been featured at air shows across the USA. In 1945, Denmark resumed control over Greenland after being liberated from Nazi occupation. In 1953, Greenland was formally integrated into the Danish kingdom with equal status. This period saw efforts to develop Greenland's infrastructure, economy, and education system. Greenland is still a part of the Kingdom of Denmark. The post-war years focused on economic development, including urban development and business growth. Greenland's economy benefited from trade with the United States and Canada. Greenland has enjoyed home rule since 1979. The Danish government implemented reforms to improve cooperation between Denmark and Greenland. This included efforts to increase Greenlanders' influence over their own affairs and promote cultural and social development. In 1985, the island decided to leave the European Union, which it had joined as a part of Denmark in 1973. Greenland's strategic position during the Cold War became even more a defense necessity, a stepping stone between North America and USSR. Thule Air Base, formerly WWII West 6, built 1943, was initially established as a weather station. Thule later became a significant military base and is now the U.S. Air Force's northernmost installation. Thule became a major player in the Cold War during 1951. Camp Fist Clench was a U.S. Army research camp on the Greenland ice cap, 200 miles east of Thule Air Base. It was in use from 1957 to 1960. It served to prototype techniques used at the much larger Camp Century that we will discuss later. Thule's Arctic environment includes icebergs in North Star Bay, 2 islands, Saunders Island and Wolstenholme Island, a polar ice sheet, and the Wolstenholme Fjord. The only place on Earth where 4 active glaciers join together, Thule Air Base is considered a crown jewel due to its location across the pole from the USSR. Built in 1951 and used for Cold War operations. Home to the 821st Air Base Group, which is responsible for air base support within the Thule Defense Area for the multinational population of Team Thule. The base hosts the 12th Space Warning Squadron, which operates a ballistic missile early warning system designed to detect and track ICBMs launched against North America. Thule is also host to Detachment 1 of the 23rd Space Operations Squadron, part of the 50th Space Wing's global satellite control network. The airfield's 10,000-foot runway handles more than 3,000 U.S. and international flights per year. B-36, B-47s, and after 1955, B-52s. Thule Air Base, now known as Pituffik Space Base, is the northernmost installation of the U.S. Armed Forces. It hosts a substantial portion of the global network of missile warning sensors, providing advanced missile detection capabilities to NORAD and the United States Space Force. The base is home to the 12th Space Warning Squadron, which operates a ballistic missile early warning system designed to detect and track intercontinental ballistic missiles launched against North America. This photo shows Thule's $250 million radar installation that just received a $40 million software upgrade in 2017. One of 6 early warning systems like this around the world being improved. More than 3,500 antennas can see 3,000 miles into space. I almost forgot to say that Thule Air Base is home to the northernmost deep water port in the world, with a tugboat, the Rising Star, assisting with port operations and ice management. Thule Air Base was renamed to Patuxent Space Base on April 6, 2023. The renaming ceremony was held to better reflect its role in the U.S. Space Force and to honor the cultural heritage of Greenland. This photo shows the living quarters around the Patuxent Space Base. Now let's turn our attention to Camp Century, a scientific research and technological project camouflaging a military project of unprecedented scope. Eisenhower approved the development of Camp Century. Project Iceworm was a top-secret United States Army program during the Cold War, aimed at establishing a network of mobile nuclear missile launch sites under the Greenland ice sheet. The goal was to create a system of tunnels approximately 2,500 miles in length, capable of deploying up to 600 nuclear missiles that could reach the Soviet Union. The project was conducted under the guise of Camp Century, a publicly known research facility established in 1959. Camp Century was designed to test construction techniques under Arctic conditions and support scientific experiments. However, the true purpose was to build a covert missile base. There were engineering obstacles that had to be overcome in building Camp Century. The secret military facility had to be placed underground since it was totally exposed on the Greenland ice sheet. This by far was the greatest challenge. There were engineering obstacles that had to be overcome in building Camp Century. In 1961, NATO made an overconfident report stating that by 1970, the construction of a subsurface military base in large permanent glaciers will be perfected. They did not initially understand the ice movement, but after 5 years concluded that any facilities to be built would only last 10 years. Due to unstable ice conditions and the lack of necessary consent from the Danish government, Project Iceworm was cancelled in 1966. The remnants of Camp Century and Project Iceworm remain buried under the ice, posing environmental concerns due to the presence of toxic waste. Let's look in a little more detail at Camp Century, the Cold War base. Army engineers first used Swiss-made Peter plows to dig deep trenches in the snow and ice. The trenches were then covered with a roof of steel arches and topped with more snow. Inside, engineers set up prefabricated wooden buildings, leaving airspace on every side to minimize melting. The largest trench, known as Main Street, was more than 1,000 feet long. The engineers drilled a hole deep into the ice, constructing a well which provided 10,000 daily gallons of fresh water. Insulated, heated piping was installed for water and electricity, while a series of escape hatches were also built in case of emergency. This shows a plan view of the camp. In the end, Camp Century consisted of 26 tunnels, almost 2 miles in total. Included dormitories, kitchen and cafeteria, hospital, laundry, communications center, recreation hall, chapel, and even a barbershop. At this point, the study of glaciology became a science of securing a livable working environment under extreme harsh climate conditions. With the power of moving ice, Camp Century was squeezed out of existence. The military abandoned the base in 1967, The photo here was taken in 1969 of Camp Century underground. The Cold War scientific base was cancelled by Defense Secretary McNamara in 1963. The cost of keeping it operational, the tunnels were closing in quickly and had to be constantly re-excavated. There were questions as to whether the Minuteman missiles would be operational at 11 degrees Fahrenheit. The Air Force fiercely opposed the closing, whilst the Navy maintained that Polaris submarines, equipped with missiles constantly on the move beneath the ice sheet, would be a better solution. Of course, the Danish government's opposition of nuclear weapons on its territory did not further matters along either. In 1963, workers started to disassemble the nuclear power plant and send it back to the USA. All solid wastes were removed from Greenland. In 1966, the US Army abandoned Camp Century. Valuable materials were transported to Thule Air Force Base and then on to the USA. Everything else was left in the trenches and buried under the ice cap. In 2019, President Donald Trump floated the idea of purchasing Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark. Although the proposition was scoffed at by the island country's premier, as well as Denmark's Prime Minister, the thinking behind it was definitely not new. Despite being scarcely populated and 80% covered in ice, Greenland has long been considered a vital strategic asset for the United States, for the reasons I have discussed in this talk about Greenland's strategic location. In 1946, President Harry Truman secretly offered to buy Greenland from Denmark for $100 million worth of gold. Of course, Denmark rejected Truman's offer, but the kingdom still allowed the US to use its territory as a forward hub to thwart Moscow's ambitions in the high north. Today, as Russia remilitarizes the Arctic and China also makes inroads in the region, the US military's foothold in Greenland, although relatively small, is again becoming a linchpin in America's territorial defense. Fast forward to 2025, and the subject has once again been raised by President Trump. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this presentation, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and press the notification bell.